When you stop contacting someone you once cared about, especially in a deep emotional connection, something powerful begins to unfold, not just in the other person's mind, but in your own life first. Silence is not emptiness, it is space, and in that space, clarity begins to grow. Many people expect dramatic reactions, sudden messages, or emotional confusion from the other side, but what actually happens is far more meaningful and far more connected to personal growth than control or prediction. A woman, like any human being, responds not just to absence, but to energy, consistency, and emotional safety. When communication stops, what often emerges is reflection. She may think about what was shared, what was missing, and what truly mattered. But at the same time, you begin a transformation that is even more important than any reaction you might be waiting for. When you stop contacting someone you once deeply cared about, the first thing that begins to change is not in them, but in you, even if you don't notice it immediately. The mind initially resists silence because it is used to patterns, messages, replies, expectations, and emotional rhythms that create a sense of connection. When that pattern breaks, there is a void, and the human mind naturally tries to fill that void with thoughts, memories, assumptions, and emotional replay. You may find yourself wondering what she is doing, whether she noticed your absence, or whether she feels anything at all. But beneath all of that mental activity, something deeper is quietly shifting in your emotional system, because absence forces awareness, and awareness slowly replaces attachment with observation. In the beginning, this stage can feel uncomfortable, because emotional dependence often disguises itself as love or concern, and when contact stops, the illusion of control disappears, leaving you alone with your thoughts. But this is exactly where transformation starts, not in dramatic external reactions, but in internal recalibration, because your brain starts adjusting to a new reality where stimulation is reduced and emotional unpredictability fades. And in that space, your nervous system begins to settle in ways you don't immediately recognize. Instead of reacting to notifications or expecting replies, you begin to sit with your own time, and time itself starts feeling different, more stretched, more open, and more available for reflection. During this period, your perception of the relationship also begins to change, not because the other person has changed, but because distance creates perspective, and perspective often reveals what closeness hides. You start remembering conversations differently, not just emotionally, but analytically, noticing patterns in communication, imbalance in effort, or moments where you may have given more than you received, and these realizations are not meant to create blame, but clarity, because clarity is the first step toward emotional independence. At the same time, your expectations slowly begin to dissolve, and in that dissolution there is both discomfort and freedom, because expectation is what keeps emotional dependency alive, and when expectation weakens, self-awareness grows stronger. What many people don't realize is that silence activates self-reflection more powerfully than constant communication ever could. Because when external validation is removed, internal dialogue becomes louder, and that internal dialogue starts shaping your identity in new ways. You begin questioning not only the other person's behavior, but your own emotional patterns, why you felt the need to reach out so often, why certain responses affected you so deeply, and why absence feels heavier than presence once did. These questions are not signs of weakness, but signs of awakening, because self-inquiry is the foundation of emotional maturity, and emotional maturity is what eventually leads to stability. As this process continues, your attention gradually shifts away from her and returns to yourself, and this shift is subtle but powerful, because where attention goes, energy follows. You start noticing how much mental space was previously occupied by waiting, checking, and anticipating, and now that space becomes available for your own life again. This is where personal routines begin to reemerge, not as forced discipline, but as natural recovery. Sleep becomes more consistent, thoughts become less scattered, and emotional intensity begins to flatten into something calmer and more manageable. Even your body starts responding to this shift, because emotional stress and physical health are deeply connected. When anxiety reduces, digestion improves, sleep deepens, and energy becomes more stable, and this is where simple lifestyle choices start to matter more than anything else. A short walk in the morning begins to feel grounding, stretching becomes easier, and your breathing becomes slower and more natural. These changes may seem small, but they are part of a larger reset happening within your system, where emotional dependency is gradually being replaced with physiological balance. At the same time, your mindset begins to evolve in a way that is not forced but discovered. You stop seeing silence as punishment and start seeing it as information, and that shift changes everything. Instead of interpreting absence as rejection or failure, you begin to understand it as space that reveals truth. And truth, even when uncomfortable, is always more valuable than illusion. This is where emotional strength begins to form, not from holding on, but from learning to observe without collapsing into reaction, not from chasing answers, but from allowing time to show you clarity in its own way. In the silence that follows when you stop reaching out, something very real begins to surface, not in the other person first, but in the structure of your own daily life, because human beings are deeply shaped by repetition and emotional rhythm, and when that rhythm breaks, the mind is forced to reorganize itself. At first, there may be resistance, a pull toward old habits like checking messages, replaying conversations, or imagining responses that never arrive, but gradually those impulses start to weaken as your attention shifts from external validation to internal awareness. And this shift is where transformation quietly begins to take root without announcement or drama. When contact reduces, your emotional system no longer receives frequent stimulation, and this creates a gap that initially feels uncomfortable, but later becomes a source of clarity. Because in that gap, you begin to see how much of your energy was previously invested in anticipation rather than reality. You start noticing how often your mood depended on whether someone replied, how frequently your thoughts revolved around their behavior, and how much mental space was occupied by waiting. And this realization does not come as a sudden revelation, but as a slow unfolding that grows stronger each day you remain consistent in your distance. During this phase, your focus naturally begins to return to your own physical presence. And this is where lifestyle changes become powerful without feeling forced, because the body and mind are always connected. A simple walk in the morning, even if slow and unstructured, starts to reintroduce stability into your day. And with each step, your breathing becomes more regular, your thoughts less chaotic, and your emotional intensity begins to settle into something more manageable. Movement is not just physical in this stage, it becomes psychological grounding, especially for older adults who benefit deeply from gentle, consistent activity that supports both circulation and mental clarity. Alongside movement, your eating habits begin to play a subtle but important role in emotional recovery because the food you consume directly influences your energy levels, mood stability, and cognitive sharpness. When you shift toward lighter meals, fresh ingredients, and proper hydration, you begin to notice fewer emotional spikes and less mental fatigue, and this stability helps you detach from obsessive thinking patterns that were previously fueled by stress and irregular habits. Even small changes like reducing processed food or maintaining regular meal times can create a noticeable difference in how calm and centered your mind feels throughout the day. As your physical system stabilizes, your emotional dependency naturally starts to weaken, not because you are forcing detachment, but because your internal environment is becoming more balanced than your external attachments. You begin to realize that much of the emotional urgency you once felt was tied to inconsistency, not genuine necessity, and this understanding slowly dissolves the illusion that constant contact equals emotional security. In reality, security comes from stability within yourself, not from the unpredictability of another person's responses, and this is a lesson that becomes clearer only in silence. Over time, your daily structure begins to rebuild itself in a healthier form, where your mornings feel less rushed, your evenings feel more peaceful, and your mind is no longer constantly divided between present activity and emotional expectation. You start engaging with simple tasks with more presence, whether it is organizing your space, preparing a meal, or spending quiet time outdoors, and these ordinary actions begin to feel meaningful again because they are no longer overshadowed by emotional distraction. At the same time, your perspective on relationships starts to mature because distance has a way of revealing patterns that closeness often hides. You begin to understand that healthy emotional connections do not rely on confusion or uncertainty, but on mutual effort and consistent communication. And when that consistency is missing, silence becomes not a punishment, but a reflection of reality. This understanding does not create bitterness when it is processed correctly. Instead, it creates emotional neutrality, where you no longer feel the need to interpret every absence as a sign or every delay as a message. As days continue in this new rhythm, your attention becomes less reactive and more observant, and this shift is extremely important because observation without emotional escalation is the foundation of mental strength. You begin to notice that your thoughts are no longer dominated by one person, but are gradually expanding to include your own goals, health, routines, and long-term well-being, and this expansion is not forced. It is the natural result of reclaiming mental space that was previously occupied by emotional dependency. As silence continues after you stop reaching out, something subtle but deeply powerful begins to reshape your inner world. And it is not immediate relief or sudden emotional freedom, but a gradual rewiring of how your mind processes attachment, attention, and self-worth. Because when external communication fades, your internal dialogue becomes the primary voice you hear, and that voice slowly starts to change its tone from emotional urgency to quiet reflection. At first, your thoughts may still circle around the person, replaying moments, analyzing responses, and questioning meanings. But even within that cycle, a shift begins to form as you start observing your own thinking instead of being controlled by it. This observation is the beginning of real emotional maturity, because most emotional struggle does not come from what happens outside, but from how deeply the mind attaches meaning to it. And when you stop reacting immediately to those thoughts and instead allow them to pass without feeding them, you create space between emotion and response. In that space, awareness grows, and awareness is what gradually breaks the automatic patterns of overthinking, dependency, and emotional reactivity. You begin to notice that not every thought deserves action, not every memory needs interpretation, and not every silence needs to be filled with assumptions. And this realization starts to loosen the emotional grip that once felt constant and overwhelming. During this process, your mindset slowly shifts from external focus to internal grounding. And this shift is not just psychological, but also deeply behavioral, because your daily actions begin to reflect your changing priorities. Instead of waiting for messages or checking your phone repeatedly, you start redirecting that energy into small but meaningful routines that stabilize your day. And these routines, although simple, begin to rebuild your sense of control. Even activities like organizing your space, preparing your meals with more care, or spending time in quiet reflection start to carry more weight, because they are no longer distractions, but anchors that bring you back to yourself. As your mental space clears, your emotional intensity begins to soften, and this softening is not emotional numbness, but emotional balance, where feelings still exist but no longer dominate your behavior. You start realizing that emotional peace is not found in constant connection, but in the ability to remain steady, even in absence. And this understanding changes how you interpret relationships entirely. Instead of seeing communication as a measure of value, you begin to see it as a reflection of alignment, timing, and mutual presence, and this perspective removes much of the pressure that once surrounded your expectations. At the same time, your awareness of self-worth begins to strengthen quietly, not through affirmations or external validation, but through lived experience. You start recognizing how much emotional energy you previously invested without return, and instead of regret, this recognition brings clarity, because clarity helps you separate attachment from identity. You begin to understand that your value does not increase when someone responds, nor does it decrease when they remain silent, and this understanding becomes a turning point in how you relate not just to others, but to yourself. In this evolving state, your attention naturally starts shifting toward your own well-being, and this is where lifestyle begins to play a crucial role in reinforcing emotional stability. You may find yourself more aware of your sleep patterns, noticing how rest affects your mood, or more conscious of how physical movement influences your thoughts. A simple walk becomes more than exercise. It becomes a way to regulate emotion, to release mental tension, and to reconnect with the present moment. Light activity helps your body process stress more efficiently, especially for older adults, where consistent movement supports both mental clarity and physical health without requiring intense effort. Nutrition also begins to feel more important in this phase, because you start noticing the connection between what you consume and how you feel emotionally. Lighter, more natural foods contribute to a sense of balance, while heavy or irregular eating patterns tend to amplify mental fatigue and emotional fluctuations. As you bring more structure to your meals, your body responds with greater stability, and that stability feeds back into your emotional system, making it easier to remain calm and centered, even when thoughts arise. Gradually, your identity begins to separate from the emotional narrative you were once caught in, and you start seeing yourself not as someone waiting for a response, but as someone rebuilding internal strength. This is where real transformation happens quietly, because you are no longer defined by anticipation or uncertainty, but by presence and self-regulation. You begin to feel more anchored in your own life, more aware of your own needs, and more capable of holding emotional space without collapsing into reaction. And this internal shift becomes the foundation for lasting emotional independence. As the silence stretches further after you stop contacting her, a different kind of awareness begins to develop, one that is less emotional and more grounded in reality, because when the noise of constant interaction fades away, truth starts to reveal itself without distortion, and you begin to see not only the relationship, but also your own patterns with greater honesty. At first, the mind still tries to hold on to old expectations, imagining outcomes or replaying scenarios, but slowly those mental loops begin to lose their emotional charge as you start noticing that your life continues even without the responses you once waited for, and that realization quietly shifts your internal balance. This shift is not dramatic, it is subtle and steady, and it often begins with something as simple as noticing how much time you suddenly have when you are not constantly checking your phone or analyzing communication. And in that extra time, you begin to observe yourself more clearly. You see how much energy was previously tied to anticipation, how many moments of your day were shaped by waiting, and how that waiting created a kind of emotional dependency that felt important at the time, but now feels unnecessary. This awareness does not bring immediate relief, but it introduces clarity, and clarity is what slowly replaces confusion with understanding. As this process continues, your attention begins to move away from external validation and returns to internal structure, and this is where lifestyle changes begin to support emotional transformation in a very natural way. You may find yourself adjusting your sleep patterns, going to bed earlier, or waking up with less mental pressure. And this improvement in rest begins to influence your emotional stability in a noticeable way. Sleep is not just physical recovery, it is emotional reset. And when your sleep becomes more consistent, your thoughts during the day become less reactive and more organized, allowing you to process emotions without being overwhelmed by them. At the same time, your body begins to respond to this emotional shift because reduced stress leads to improved physical energy, and with that energy comes the motivation to move more, even in small ways. A morning walk becomes a grounding ritual rather than a task, and during that walk, your mind starts to slow down naturally, observing surroundings instead of replaying past conversations. This gentle movement helps regulate both mood and circulation, and for older adults especially, it becomes a powerful tool for maintaining not only physical health, but also emotional clarity without strain or intensity. Alongside movement, your eating habits also begin to reflect your changing mindset, because when emotional turbulence decreases, your relationship with food becomes more mindful. You start noticing how different foods affect your energy, how heavy meals may slow your thinking, and how lighter, more balanced nutrition supports mental calmness throughout the day. This awareness leads you to make quieter but healthier choices, such as eating more natural foods, staying hydrated, and maintaining regular meal timing. And these simple adjustments begin to stabilize your internal system in ways that support emotional resilience. As your physical and emotional stability increases, your perception of relationships begins to evolve as well, and you start understanding that silence is not always a message to decode, but often a reflection of alignment or distance that already exists. Instead of interpreting every absence as rejection or every delay as uncertainty, you begin to see communication patterns more objectively, without attaching your self-worth to them. And this shift is extremely important because it removes emotional distortion from your thinking. In this stage, your mind becomes less reactive and more observational, and this observation creates space between thought and emotion, allowing you to respond to life rather than react impulsively to it. You begin to notice how thoughts come and go without needing to act on them immediately, and this awareness reduces emotional intensity significantly. Instead of being pulled into constant analysis, you start allowing situations to exist without over-interpreting them, and this mental distance creates a sense of calm that was previously missing. Gradually, your focus expands beyond the relationship entirely, and you start reconnecting with your own routines, interests, and responsibilities in a more meaningful way. Simple daily activities begin to feel more structured and intentional, and your time starts to feel like it belongs to you again, rather than being emotionally divided. This restoration of personal space is one of the most powerful outcomes of silence because it returns control of your attention back to your own life. Over time, you realize that what once felt like emotional loss was actually an opportunity for reorganization, where your thoughts, habits, and priorities are being realigned into something more stable. You begin to feel less dependent on external responses and more confident in your own presence. And this confidence is not loud or forced. It is quiet and steady, built through experience rather than expectation. As the silence becomes your new normal and you continue not reaching out, something very different begins to happen, not in the world outside you first, but in the way you start to carry yourself through each day. Because when emotional dependency begins to dissolve, your attention slowly returns to the only place it was always meant to stay, your own life, your own body, your own thoughts, and your own direction. And this return does not feel like excitement at first. It feels like neutrality, a calm space where emotional urgency is no longer dictating your behavior or pulling your focus away from the present moment. In the beginning of this stage, you may still notice small traces of old habits, like checking your phone without reason or briefly thinking about whether she noticed your absence. But these thoughts no longer control your emotional state the way they once did. And instead of following them into deeper analysis, you begin to observe them and let them pass. And this ability to observe without attachment becomes one of the most powerful signs that your internal balance is shifting in a meaningful way. As this quiet transformation continues, your energy starts to redirect itself naturally, not because you are forcing discipline, but because your mind no longer has the same emotional distractions occupying it, and this freed energy begins to show up in small but important areas of your life. You may find yourself waking up with more clarity, feeling less mental heaviness in the morning, or noticing that your thoughts are not as scattered as before, and this creates a foundation where your daily actions begin to feel more intentional rather than reactive. In this stage, lifestyle choices begin to play a deeply supportive role in strengthening your emotional stability, especially through simple habits that reconnect your body and mind. Light physical movement becomes more than just exercise. It becomes a form of emotional grounding, where even a short walk allows your thoughts to settle and your breathing to regulate naturally. And during this time, your mind starts to detach from repetitive emotional loops and becomes more present in your surroundings. For older adults especially, this kind of gentle movement supports both mental calmness and physical well-being, creating a balance that does not rely on intensity, but on consistency. At the same time, your relationship with food begins to shift in subtle but meaningful ways, because as emotional intensity decreases, you start becoming more aware of how your body responds to what you consume. Heavy or irregular eating patterns begin to feel less appealing, and you naturally gravitate towards simpler, more nourishing choices that support steady energy throughout the day. This shift is not about strict dieting, but about listening to your body more closely, noticing how hydration improves clarity, how balanced meals reduce fatigue, and how consistent eating patterns contribute to emotional steadiness. As your physical habits become more balanced, your emotional perception also begins to stabilize, and you start viewing silence not as a source of anxiety, but as a neutral space where no assumptions are required. Instead of trying to interpret every delay or absence, you begin to accept that communication reflects timing, alignment, and mutual intention, and this acceptance removes a large amount of emotional pressure that once occupied your mind. You no longer feel the need to decode every situation, because you begin to trust that clarity reveals itself naturally when you are no longer emotionally overinvested in outcomes. This shift also changes the way you see yourself, because without constant emotional reaction, you begin to reconnect with your own identity outside of the relationship narrative. You start noticing your own preferences again, your own interests, your own routines, and slowly, you begin to rebuild a sense of individuality that was previously overshadowed by emotional focus on someone else. This is where self-respect starts to strengthen quietly, not through external validation, but through internal recognition that your time, attention, and energy have value beyond any single connection. As days continue in this new rhythm, your mindset becomes more stable and less reactive, and you start experiencing moments of genuine peace where your thoughts are not driven by uncertainty or emotional turbulence. You begin to appreciate small routines, simple responsibilities, and quiet moments without needing external stimulation to feel complete, and this simplicity becomes a source of strength rather than emptiness. Gradually, you realize that the most important transformation was never about how she might respond or whether she notices your absence, but about how you respond to your own life when external noise is removed. And in that realization, you begin to carry yourself differently, with more calm, more presence, and more emotional independence, not because you are trying to impress anyone, but because you are finally no longer disconnected from yourself.